Imagine being told that the most iconic, visually defining element of the American cowboy, the low-slung, tied-down leather holster resting perfectly on the thigh, ready for a lightning-fast high-noon quick draw, is nothing more than a complete cinematic fabrication invented by 20th-century costume designers to make actors look more heroic on the silver screen. The brutal, unvarnished reality of how the deadliest killers, lawmen, and outlaws actually carried their heavy artillery on the frontier was not dictated by aesthetics or looking intimidating. It was a cold, calculated science of biomechanics, gravity, and the desperate need to deploy a weapon from the saddle of a panicked horse or from underneath a felt-covered poker table in a fraction of a second. The men who actually bled into the prairie dust understood that the geometry of the draw was just as critical as the metallurgy of the gun itself, because the fastest revolver in the world is completely mathematically useless if it gets hopelessly tangled in a heavy wool coat or if the sheer length of the barrel physically prevents you from clearing the leather before your adversary puts a .44 caliber slug through your sternum. But before we completely dismantle these Hollywood wardrobe myths and explore the terrifying, highly engineered leather rigs and mechanical holsters that gave professional gunfighters an undetectable, blindingly fast advantage in close-quarters combat, I need to know exactly who is standing on the firing line with us today. So pause this video right now and drop your city and state down in the comments below, so we can map out our global battalion of history hounds and see exactly where our squad is holding the line against the modern noise today. Because we are about to dive into the raw, unvarnished mechanics of frontier survival, starting with an invention so terrifyingly efficient and mechanically deceptive that it completely eliminated the need to draw a weapon at all. I am talking about the obscure, highly controversial, and utterly lethal swivel holster, a piece of customized frontier gear that fundamentally broke the rules of engagement. In a traditional gunfight, the human eye is trained to watch the opponent's shoulder and elbow for the telltale upward motion of the draw, a biological telegraph that gives a trained killer a fraction of a second to react and deploy their own weapon. But a man wearing a swivel holster did not pull his gun upward. The leather holster itself was riveted to the gun belt on a heavy steel pivot point, and the bottom of the holster was completely open-toed, leaving the muzzle of the revolver exposed. When an altercation turned violent, the operator simply dropped his hand, gripped the butt of the revolver, and forcefully pushed the muzzle upward, physically rotating the entire holster on its steel axis until the barrel was pointing directly at the target's stomach, allowing the shooter to simply pull the trigger and fire the weapon directly through the open bottom of the leather rig without the gun ever actually leaving the holster. The psychological shock of this mechanical trick was absolute and devastating. Imagine being a hardened outlaw, aggressively stepping up to a seemingly calm lawman, fully expecting the man to make a sweeping, desperate pull for his weapon, giving you the necessary time to drop him, but instead, the lawman's hand barely twitches downward, the bottom of his holster suddenly violently kicks upward, and a blinding flash of black powder completely shreds your lower torso before your brain can even process that a shot has been fired. The swivel holster was the ultimate, mechanized cheat code for close-quarter survival, mathematically bypassing the agonizingly slow biological process of lifting a heavy piece of steel up and out of a deep leather pouch, and replacing it with a localized, rotating turret that could be deployed faster than the human eye could track. But while the swivel holster relied on a hidden mechanical pivot, the vast majority of professional gunfighters had to rely on the brutal geometry of their own bodies, leading to the massive proliferation of a carry style that Hollywood has almost completely erased from the public consciousness, the high-riding cross-draw and the reverse-draw cavalry carry. If you look at authentic, historical tintype photographs from the 19th century, you will almost never see a man wearing his gun slung low on his thigh like John Wayne. Instead, you will see men wearing their gun belts extremely high, strapped tightly around their natural waist, often with the butts of the revolvers facing completely backward. They were told by modern filmmakers that drawing a gun with the butt facing backward was awkward and slow, but the men of the West knew that when you were sitting in the saddle of a horse for 14 hours a day, a low-slung holster will physically beat your leg black and blue, and the sheer length of a 7.5-inch revolver barrel makes pulling it straight up into your own armpit an absolute biomechanical nightmare. The reverse draw, or the cavalry twist draw, was a highly calculated solution where the shooter reached their hand across their body, or twisted their wrist outward, to grasp the backward-facing butt of the weapon, allowing them to draw the heavy revolver across their torso in a smooth, sweeping, horizontal arc that naturally leveled the heavy barrel directly at the target the exact millisecond it cleared the leather. This ergonomic geometry was particularly devastating when seated at a poker table. A gambler could naturally rest his hands near his stomach, completely concealing his true intentions, and then utilize a blistering fast cross-draw to produce a weapon from a high-riding belly holster, mathematically beating an opponent who was forced to awkwardly lean to the side and pull a long-barreled revolver up from his hip while sitting in a wooden chair. The men who truly understood the mathematics of survival recognized that the holster was not merely a carrying case, it was the launching pad for their artillery, and any friction, any unnecessary movement, any snag of the heavy front sight on the thick leather lining was an immediate, fatal liability in a world where gunfights were decided in tenths of a second. And this absolute, paranoid obsession with speed and immediate firepower led to perhaps the most terrifying and brutally practical tactical doctrine of the entire frontier era, a combat philosophy born in the blood-soaked guerrilla warfare of the American Civil War and perfected by the most ruthless outlaw syndicates of the West, the doctrine of the New York reload, or more accurately, the border shift, which dictated that the fastest reload on the planet was simply drawing another loaded gun. We look at the massive, heavy percussion cap revolvers of the era, like the legendary Colt Dragoon or the 1851 Navy, and we marvel at their beautiful engineering, but we often forget the agonizing, terrifying reality that reloading one of these weapons in the middle of a chaotic, screaming firefight was a mathematical impossibility. To reload a cap and bore revolver, a man had to meticulously measure and pour loose black powder into each chamber, press a heavy lead ball over the powder, use a mechanical rammer to seat the ball, seal the chamber with grease to prevent a chain fire, and finally, delicately pinch tiny, fragile brass percussion caps onto the rear nipples of the cylinder. Attempting to perform this intricate, fine motor skill operation while your hands are covered in your own blood, the air is thick with blinding, suffocating sulfurous smoke, and men are actively trying to put a bullet through your skull is an absolute biological fantasy. So, the deadliest killers of the era, men like the infamous Missouri bushwhackers, Bloody Bill Anderson, and the early iterations of the James Younger gang, completely bypassed the reloading process by turning themselves into walking, biological arsenals, strapping 3, 4, or even 6 fully loaded heavy-caliber revolvers to their bodies at all times. They would carry 2 in traditional belt holsters, 2 tucked directly into their waistbands or heavy silk sashes, and often 2 more strapped to their saddle horns. When they initiated an ambush, they did not fire carefully aimed shots and wait to reload. They charged forward on horseback with the reins held in their teeth, drawing 2 massive revolvers simultaneously and dumping all 12 rounds into the enemy ranks in a deafening, continuous roar of overlapping thunder. The exact millisecond the hammers clicked on empty percussion nipples, they did not hesitate. They instantly dropped the heavy, smoking iron directly into the dirt, smoothly reached into their waistbands, produced 2 completely fresh, fully loaded revolvers, and seamlessly continued the apocalyptic barrage of heavy lead without missing a single beat. The psychological devastation of facing a guerrilla unit utilizing this overwhelming, cascading volume of fire was absolute, because the federal troops or local posses attempting to fight them would mentally calculate that the outlaws had to stop shooting to reload, only to be met by an unrelenting, physically impossible wall of continuous lead that completely shredded their ranks and shattered their morale. This brutal tactic mathematically guaranteed that a single man possessed the sustained firepower of an entire squad, completely obliterating the romanticized myth of the fair, single-shot duel and replacing it with a horrifying, industrialized meat grinder where survival was directly proportional to the sheer weight of loaded iron a man was willing to carry into the fray. The physical toll of carrying over 15 pounds of solid steel and lead on your body in the sweltering heat of the summer plains was immense, but these men eagerly accepted the crushing weight and the discomfort because they understood the fundamental, unforgiving arithmetic of frontier violence. You can never have too much ammunition in a gunfight, and the man who runs dry first is the man who gets buried. The evolution of these terrifying tactical carrying methods, from the mechanically deceptive swivel holsters and the biomechanically perfect cross-draw rigs, to the brutal, overwhelming strategy of carrying half a dozen customized revolvers into combat, proves that the true history of the American West is not a story of polished silver screens or neat, cinematic choreography. It is a raw, gritty, incredibly technical study of human beings desperately manipulating physics, leather, and heavy machinery to give themselves a fractional, life-saving advantage in an environment that actively, relentlessly tried to kill them every single day. They were told that the sophisticated gentlemen of the 19th century, the wealthy riverboat gamblers, the European investors, and the traveling corporate barons who ventured into the untamed American frontier relied entirely on their silver-tongued diplomacy, their expensive tailored suits, and their hired Pinkerton bodyguards to protect them from the ruthless, bloodthirsty predators of the boomtowns, but the absolute, terrifying reality of the criminal underworld dictated that diplomacy was a mathematical luxury that only dead men could afford. The men who actually survived the claustrophobic, smoke-filled salons and the violent, pitch-black alleyways of the frontier understood that a traditional heavy-barreled revolver was far too cumbersome to conceal beneath a tailored waistcoat, leading to the invention of a close-quarters weapon so brilliantly malicious, so utterly devoid of sporting ethics or honorable intent, that it was actively banned by the very criminal syndicates that inspired its creation. I am talking about the infamous Apache Revolver, an absolute mechanical nightmare of industrialized brutality that perfectly combined the three most devastating tools of street-level assassination into a single, terrifyingly compact piece of folding pocket geometry. Originating in the violent underworld of the French street gangs but quickly making its way into the pockets of the most dangerous cardsharps and assassins of the American West, the Apache was not a traditional firearm. It was a heavy brass-knuckle duster that featured a hidden, spring-loaded, razor-sharp steel wave blade folding out from the knuckles, and a completely exposed, barrel-less six-shot pinfire revolver cylinder mounted directly onto the central axis of the weapon. The mechanical terror of the Apache was its absolute, fluid versatility in the darkest, most chaotic moments of human conflict, because the operator did not need to draw, aim, or calculate ballistics. They simply slipped their fingers through the heavy brass rings while the weapon was still hidden inside their coat pocket. If negotiations at the poker table failed, the operator could instantly crush the opponent's orbital bone with a devastating brass-knuckle strike, immediately deploy the hidden steel blade to mathematically dismantle their biological defenses, and then press the exposed cylinder directly into the victim's ribs, dumping 6 heavy pinfire cartridges at point-blank range in a matter of seconds. The Apache completely lacked a barrel, meaning it possessed absolutely zero effective range and practically zero accuracy beyond arm's reach, but in the brutal arithmetic of a saloon brawl, range was completely irrelevant. It was an instrument of localized, physical destruction designed to ensure that whoever initiated the violence would be immediately met with a cascading, overlapping combination of blunt force trauma, lacerations, and catastrophic ballistic shock. But before we rip the intricate clockwork out of the rest of these concealed frontier horrors and explore the terrifying mechanical ingenuity that allowed desperate men to hide heavy artillery in plain sight, I need to know exactly who is standing shoulder to shoulder with us in the trenches today. So pause this video right now and drop your city and state down in the comments below, so we can map out our global battalion of history hounds and see exactly where our squad is holding the line against the modern noise today. Because we are about to dive into the raw, unvarnished history of how the West was actually won, starting with a weapon that attempted to completely revolutionize infantry warfare but instead delivered an absolute, terrifying mechanical death sentence to the men who dared to pull its trigger. Imagine being a seasoned frontiersman, accustomed to the slow, agonizing reload times of single-shot muzzle-loading rifles, suddenly being handed the magnificent, highly engineered Colt Model 1855 Revolving Rifle, a weapon that promised to deliver the blistering, rapid-fire capability of a Colt revolver in the stable, long-range platform of a shoulder-fired hunting rifle. The mathematics of the design seemed flawless, utilizing a massive, enlarged rotating cylinder to hold 5 or 6 heavy-caliber lead slugs, allowing a lone scout or a stagecoach guard to completely saturate an enemy position with overwhelming firepower without ever taking the heavy wooden stock off their shoulder. But the brilliant engineers at Colt had drastically underestimated a terrifying, catastrophic phenomenon known as chain firing, a brutal physical reality where the massive, violently expanding cloud of superheated black powder gases escaping from the barrel cylinder gap could accidentally ignite the exposed percussion caps or the loose powder resting in the adjacent and fire chambers. When a standard Colt handgun chain fired, it was a terrifying, wrist-shattering experience, but because the shooter's hands were behind the cylinder, they usually survived with minor burns and bruised fingers. However, the biomechanical geometry of holding a rifle absolutely requires the operator to extend their non-firing hand far forward, physically gripping the wooden forend of the barrel directly in front of the massive, loaded cylinder. Imagine the absolute, paralyzing horror of aiming at a distant target, meticulously pulling the trigger of the 1855 revolving rifle, and experiencing a catastrophic, instantaneous chain detonation of 5 heavy caliber chambers going off simultaneously, essentially turning the center of the rifle into a localized, fragmented hand grenade that violently detonates directly into the soft tissue, tendons, and bones of your extended supporting arm. The structural failure of the revolving rifle was so mathematically consistent and so biologically devastating that seasoned frontiersmen utterly refused to hold the weapon properly, instead awkwardly resting the heavy barrel on a barricade or holding the rifle entirely behind the trigger guard, completely destroying its accuracy and effectively rendering its rapid-fire advantage completely useless. It was a beautiful, hyper-advanced piece of 19th-century machinery that treated the operator as a disposable biological variable, proving that in the desperate arms race of the Wild West, pushing the mechanical limits of black powder often resulted in an explosive, amputating disaster that shattered the Hollywood myth of flawless frontier engineering. And while the military and the frontiersmen were busy blowing their own hands off with experimental revolving rifles, the true, undetected apex predators of the urban frontier, the professional gamblers and the riverboat swindlers, were perfecting the dark art of invisible ballistics by turning the most mundane, aristocratic accessories into devastating, heavy-caliber problem solvers. They laughed when they saw a wealthy, impeccably dressed gentleman walking through a muddy cattle town leaning heavily on a beautifully carved, silver-tipped walking stick, assuming he was nothing more than a soft, vulnerable target waiting to be robbed, entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that he was actually carrying the legendary Remington percussion cane gun, a fully functional, highly lethal firearm disguised as a piece of high society fashion. Designed by the visionary gunsmith John F. Thomas in 1858, the Remington Cane Gun was not a fragile, low-powered parlor toy. It was a heavily machined, seamless steel tube covered in hard vulcanized rubber to mimic the texture of polished wood, concealing a devastating 31 or 32 caliber rifle barrel that ran the entire length of the stick. The absolute mechanical genius of the cane gun was its completely hidden, snag-free firing mechanism, which lacked a traditional trigger or an exposed hammer that would give away its true lethal nature. To deploy the weapon, the operator simply pulled back the heavy, decorative handle, whether it was a silver dogger's head or a simple curved grip, which physically drew back a hidden internal striker and locked it into a compressed, high-tension position. When the gambler was inevitably cornered by a sore loser or a violent outlaw in the narrow, claustrophobic hallways of a Mississippi riverboat, he did not need to frantically fumble for a pocket pistol. He simply leveled the tip of his walking stick directly at the attacker's chest and subtly pressed a tiny, almost invisible metal stud resting flush against the shaft of the cane. The mechanical release of that hidden button sent the heavy striker slamming forward into a percussion cap, instantly igniting a heavy powder charge and sending a lethal lead projectile tearing through the aggressor's vital organs before they even realized a weapon had been drawn. The psychological terror of the cane gun was its absolute, invisible unpredictability, transforming a symbol of physical frailty and wealth into a devastating, point-blank assassination tool that allowed the operator to dictate the exact moment of lethal engagement without ever visually escalating the conflict. This invisible, heavily mechanized approach to survival proved that the most dangerous men in the West were not always the loud, dusty cowboys wearing massive iron on their hips. They were often the quiet, mathematically precise individuals who understood that the element of absolute surprise was infinitely more valuable than the kinetic energy of a .44 caliber slug. But if we are searching for the ultimate, mathematically flawless, physics-defying underdog victory of the entire frontier era, a moment where the sheer, overwhelming power of mass-produced, heavily engineered repeating firearms completely dismantled a hardened, professional criminal syndicate, we must look to the blood-soaked, sun-baked streets of Coffeyville, Kansas, on the morning of October 5, 1892. They were told that the infamous Dalton Gang, a heavily armed, highly experienced cavalry of bank robbers who had terrorized the Midwest for years, were absolutely unstoppable, possessing a level of tactical coordination and raw firepower that local law enforcement simply could not match. The Daltons, blinded by their own legendary status and completely overestimating their tactical superiority, decided to execute a mathematically absurd, highly arrogant operation. They planned to rob two different banks on opposite sides of the Coffeyville Town Plaza at the exact same time. Believing that the sheer shock and awe of their coordinated assault would paralyze the civilian population and allow them to escape with a massive fortune. But as the five heavily armed outlaws disguised themselves with fake beards and aggressively marched into the First National Bank and the Condon Bank, they fundamentally failed to calculate the most dangerous variable in the frontier survival equation, the absolute, unyielding rage of an armed, industrialized civilian populace that had finally had enough. A local citizen recognized the outlaws through their disguises and immediately began screaming that the banks were being robbed, completely shattering the element of surprise and instantly triggering a terrifying, spontaneous, localized mobilization of extreme violence. The citizens of Coffeyville did not cower in fear or wait for the sheriff. They sprinted directly to Ishamus Hardware Store and Cubine's Hardware Store, violently kicking the doors open and frantically tearing open wooden shipping crates filled with brand new, factory-fresh Winchester lever action rifles, heavy double-barreled shotguns, and thousands of rounds of high-velocity metallic cartridges. Within 3 minutes, the geometry of the Coffeyville town plaza had been completely, mathematically transformed into a highly coordinated, inescapable kill zone, with dozens of furious townspeople taking up elevated, fortified sniper positions on the flat roofs of the buildings, crouching behind heavy stone pillars, and barricading themselves in the alleyways, effectively creating a perfect, overlapping funnel of 360-degree crossfire. When the Dalton gang finally attempted to exit the banks, carrying heavy canvas sacks filled with stolen cash, they did not step out into a terrified, subjugated town. They stepped directly into an apocalyptic, deafening hurricane of flying lead, shattered glass, and exploding brickwork. The sheer, overwhelming volume of sustained fire projected by the civilian defenders was mathematically impossible for the 5 outlaws to overcome, because every single time a Dalton attempted to raise his Winchester or level his Colt revolver, he was immediately struck by multiple heavy-caliber projectiles from 3 different directions simultaneously, completely destroying his biological ability to fight back. The outlaws frantically tried to retreat down a narrow corridor known as Death Alley to reach their tied horses, but the townspeople had perfectly calculated the geometry of their escape route, pouring a continuous, deafening barrage of buckshot and rifle fire into the confined space, literally shredding the wooden fences and instantly turning the alleyway into a localized meat grinder. In less than 15 minutes of absolute, deafening, mechanized slaughter, the legendary, unstoppable Dalton gang was completely, biologically erased from the earth, with 4 outlaws shot to pieces in the dirt and the 5th bleeding from dozens of massive wounds, completely neutralized not by professional lawmen or federal troops, but by a spontaneous, highly coordinated civilian militia utilizing the absolute bleeding edge of mass-produced, lever action firepower to mathematically trap their oppressors in a flawless tactical crossfire. This was the true, unvarnished reality of the American West, a brutal, unforgiving era where survival was not dictated by cinematic destiny or Hollywood choreography, but by the cold, hard, metallurgical facts of superior firepower, spatial geometry, and the absolute, unbreakable will of ordinary people who refused to be victims in a lawless land. These silent, rusted artifacts, the folding Apache revolvers, the lethal walking sticks, and the factory-fresh Winchester rifles of the Coffeyville defenders, are not just inanimate objects. They are the physical, ironclad monuments to a time when human beings relied entirely on the explosive physics of black powder and the flawless mechanics of machined steel to impose their will upon a hostile, terrifying world. But the modern algorithms, the sterile, digital systems that quietly dictate what we consume and ultimately what we remember, are actively, relentlessly working to bury these visceral, gunpowder-soaked truths beneath an endless, scrolling wave of pacifying, meaningless distractions. They want to slowly erase the raw, mechanical heritage of the men who actually bled into the prairie dirt to forge the reality we so comfortably inhabit today, replacing the sharp, metallic smell of burning sulfur and the deafening, chest-thumping roar of a lever action rifle with a neat, tidy, and completely fictional narrative written by people who have never held the cold, heavy weight of survival in their own hands. They want you to believe that history is nothing more than a polite debate, completely ignoring the terrifying, chaotic struggle for existence that was ultimately decided by the turn of a wrench, the precise calculation of an ambush, and the violent pull of a trigger in the dark. So, if you actually felt the massive, kinetic echo of that history vibrating in your chest today, if you truly understand the absolute, critical importance of preserving these raw, unvarnished stories of mechanical survival against the relentless, crushing tide of digital amnesia, then you must weaponize this algorithm right now. You must crush the like button, share this massive transmission with every true history hound and mechanical purist in your network, and make absolutely sure that the digital overlords know that we will never allow our grit, our iron, and our unvarnished history to fade into the abyss of forgotten content. I need you to go down into the comment section right now and prove to the world that you are a permanent part of the global battalion that still respects the iron, the blood, and the absolute truth, by typing the exact words, "We hold the line." Show them that our formation is unbreakable, and that every single time they try to bury our legacy beneath the noise, they will look down and see us standing strong, waiting for the next order. Imagine being told that the men who guarded the massive shipments of gold bullion, silver, ore, and federal currency across the most treacherous, outlaw-infested territories of the American frontier relied exclusively on standard-issue domestic firearms, believing that the American factories of Colt and Winchester held the absolute monopoly on close-quarters destruction. The Hollywood narrative wants you to believe that every stagecoach guard in the West was perfectly content clutching a standard 12-gauge coach gun or a traditional single-action six-shooter, but the hardened professionals who actually rode the high-risk express routes, men who mathematically calculated that their lives were the only thing standing between a gang of heavily armed highwaymen and a fortune in raw gold, actively sought out a level of localized, apocalyptic firepower that American manufacturers simply were not producing at the time. To find this unparalleled level of biological destruction, these desperate guards had to look across the ocean to the extreme, blood-soaked jungles of the British Empire, importing a weapon that was not designed to kill human beings, but was specifically and mechanically engineered to instantly shatter the skull of a leaping, 600-pound Bengal tiger in mid-air. I am talking about the terrifying, or inspiring Howdah pistol, an absolute mechanical monstrosity consisting of 2, and sometimes even 4, massive, side-by-side barrels chambered in incomprehensible artillery calibers like the .577 Snyder or the massive .65 caliber. The physics of firing a Howdah pistol from the cramped, violently bouncing wooden seat of a stagecoach defy all modern logic, because these weapons were essentially handheld, sawed-off elephant guns that fired massive, solid-lead conical projectiles capable of completely ignoring the wooden walls of a stagecoach or the heavy muscle mass of a galloping horse. When an outlaw syndicate attempted to ambush an express shipment, expecting to easily overwhelm a guard armed with a standard revolver, they were instead met with a blinding, deafening thunderclap of British Imperial ballistics, as the guard unleashed a massive, half-inch slug that possessed enough kinetic energy to literally sever limbs and instantly neutralize multiple targets standing in a linear formation. The recoil of the Howdah was so unbelievably violent that it frequently fractured the wrist bones of the men firing it, but professional guards eagerly accepted this physical trauma, knowing that the absolute, overwhelming hydrostatic shock delivered by the weapon mathematically guaranteed that any man hit by it would never take another step forward. But before we delve deeper into the bizarre chemical failures and the physics-defying underdog victories that define the true history of frontier ballistics, I need to know exactly who is riding shotgun with us today, so pause this video right now and drop your city and state down in the comments below, so we can map out our global battalion of history hounds and see exactly where our squad is holding the line against the modern noise today. Because we are about to examine the absolute bleeding edge of 19th century engineering, starting with a weapon that completely failed in its primary objective but accidentally laid the mechanical foundation for the entire lever-action empire. They were told that the transition from single-shot muzzleloaders to repeating rifles was a smooth, linear progression of brilliant American ingenuity, completely ignoring the terrifying, explosive missteps and the downright mathematically absurd inventions that paved the way for the Winchester rifle. We have to look at the beautifully complex, incredibly ambitious, and ultimately disastrous volcanic repeating pistol and rifle, a system that attempted to completely revolutionize frontier warfare by inventing caseless ammunition decades before modern militaries even considered the concept. The genius engineers Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson, before they built their revolver empire, attempted to solve the agonizingly slow reload times of the era by creating a lever action mechanism that fed a completely revolutionary type of ammunition called the rocket ball. The mechanical concept was staggering. Instead of using a brass casing to hold the gunpowder, the designers physically hollowed out the base of the lead bullet itself, packing the tiny cavity with a minute amount of black powder and sealing it with a fragile primer cap. This meant that the tubular magazine under the barrel could hold a massive amount of ammunition, up to 10 rounds in a handgun, allowing the operator to simply work the lever and fire a continuous stream of lead without ever having to extract empty brass casings. However, the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics and chemistry completely betrayed the volcanic system, because by eliminating the expanding brass casing, the weapon had no way to mechanically seal the firing chamber, meaning that when the tiny powder charge ignited, a massive amount of the explosive gas violently leaked backward out of the breech, completely destroying the kinetic energy of the projectile. The ballistics of the volcanic rocket ball were an absolute mathematical joke. The muzzle velocity was so pathetically low that the bullets often lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate a heavy winter coat, and historical accounts claim that a man once attempted to commit suicide with a volcanic pistol and survived shooting himself in the head multiple times because the projectiles simply bounced off his skull. The weapon was a catastrophic commercial failure, prone to horrifying chain detonations in the magazine and completely unsuited for the brutal, life or death reality of frontier combat, where maximum stopping power was the only metric of survival. Yet, tucked inside the sleek, beautiful steel receiver of this failed weapon was a highly complex, revolutionary toggle-link mechanical action, a brilliant system of interlocking steel levers that provided incredible mechanical leverage to strip around and seal the breech. When Oliver Winchester purchased the bankrupt Volcanic Company, he did not throw the failed machinery away. He instructed his brilliant engineer Benjamin Tyler Henry to take that exact toggle link mechanism, scale it up, and adapt it to fire heavy, metallic rimfire cartridges, ultimately giving birth to the legendary Henry rifle and the Winchester 1873, proving that the most dominant, iconic weapons of the American West were born directly from the ashes of a completely absurd, underpowered ballistic failure. But the true mastery of these mechanized, lever-action descendants was not achieved on a drafting table or a target range. It was achieved in the chaotic, blood-soaked dirt of the frontier, bringing us to one of the most terrifying, mathematically impossible underdog victories in the history of the Wild West. A moment where a single man utilized the flawless mechanics of the lever-action rifle to completely dismantle a numerically superior force of professional killers in under 60 seconds. They laughed when the newly appointed sheriff of Navajo County, a soft-spoken, incredibly eccentric man named Commodore Perry Owens, who wore his hair down to his waist and dressed in fringed buckskin like a relic of the past, announced that he was going to personally serve an arrest warrant on the notorious outlaw Andy Cooper, a ruthless killer who was heavily fortified inside the Blevins family house in Holbrook, Arizona. The local townspeople and the criminal syndicate mathematically calculated that sending one man to arrest a hardened killer surrounded by his heavily armed family was a guaranteed suicide mission, fully expecting Owens to be shot to pieces the moment he stepped onto the porch. On the afternoon of September 4, 1887, Owens approached the wooden structure completely alone, cradling a customized Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle in the crook of his arm. When Cooper opened the front door, refusing the arrest and aggressively reaching for his own revolver, Owens did not perform a dramatic, cinematic draw, and he did not meticulously bring the heavy iron sights of the rifle to his eye. He understood that in a point-blank, close-quarters engagement, the time it takes to align your sights is the exact margin of error that gets you killed. Relying entirely on his absolute, mechanical mastery of the Winchester and his flawless spatial awareness, Owens simply dropped the barrel of the rifle to his hip, mathematically calculating the trajectory of the barrel in his mind, and fired a devastating .44-40 caliber slug straight through the wooden door, striking Cooper in the stomach and instantly neutralizing the primary threat. In the exact same fluid, violent motion, without ever raising the weapon, Owens violently racked the lever, extracting the smoking brass and chambering a fresh round just as Cooper's brother, John Blevins, shoved a revolver out of a side door to ambush the lawman. Owens instantly pivoted his hips, tracking the movement, and fired blindly from the hip again, sending a heavy lead projectile tearing through the wooden doorframe, critically wounding Blevins and shattering his arm. The psychological terror of this engagement was absolute. The outlaws were facing a man who was operating a lever-action rifle with the blinding speed and instinctive pointing accuracy of a handgun, creating a localized, continuous wall of lead that completely bypassed the need for visual aiming. As another armed associate, Mose Roberts, attempted to ambush Owens by climbing out of a side window, Owens smoothly cycled the action again, calculating the angle, and fired a third shot from the hip, driving a slug straight through Roberts' chest and dropping him into the dirt. Finally, as a 15-year-old family member, Sam Houston Blevins, rushed out the front door wielding Cooper's dropped revolver, Owens, operating with cold, emotionless, mechanized precision, cycled the lever one final time and fired his fourth shot, ending the threat instantly. In less than 1 minute, Commodore Perry Owens had stood entirely exposed on an open porch, never once bringing his rifle to his shoulder, and had mathematically dismantled 4 heavily armed men by completely exploiting the barrier-penetrating ballistics of the .44-40 cartridge and the blinding, uninterrupted cycling speed of the Winchester toggle-link action. This was not a Hollywood shootout relying on dramatic pauses or polite dialogue. It was a horrifying, industrialized display of point-shooting mechanics, proving that the deadliest weapon on the frontier was not the gun itself, but the man who had completely fused his biological reflexes with the cold, heavy machinery of his rifle, turning himself into a localized force of nature that could project lethal geometry faster than his enemies could even pull their triggers. We look back at the massive British Howdah pistols, the beautifully flawed volcanic rocket balls, and the brutal, hip-firing mechanics of Commodore Perry Owens, and we realize that the men who survived this era were participating in a ruthless, unforgiving scientific experiment, testing the absolute physical limits of metallurgy, chemistry, and human kinetic potential. These weapons are the physical, ironclad manifestations of a time when every single day was a desperate calculation of survival, a time when your life was entirely dependent on your ability to understand and brutally apply the devastating mechanical leverage locked inside your hands. But the sterile algorithms that control our modern digital landscape, the systems that silently dictate what we consume and what we remember, are actively, relentlessly working to sanitize this history, burying these visceral, gunpowder-soaked truths beneath an endless, scrolling wave of pacifying, meaningless distractions. They want to slowly erase the raw, mechanical heritage of the men who actually bled into the dirt to forge the reality we so comfortably inhabit today, replacing the sharp, metallic smell of burning sulfur and the deafening, chest-thumping roar of a point-blank lever action rifle with a neat, tidy, and completely fictional narrative written by people who have never had to trust their life to a piece of machine steel. They want you to believe that history is nothing more than a polite debate, completely ignoring the terrifying, chaotic struggle for existence that was ultimately decided by the turn of a wrench, the violent expansion of hot gas, and the pull of a trigger in the dark. So, if you actually felt the massive, kinetic echo of that history vibrating in your chest today, if you truly understand the absolute, critical importance of preserving these raw, unvarnished stories of mechanical survival against the relentless, crushing tide of digital amnesia, then you must weaponize this algorithm right now. You must crush the like button, share this massive transmission with every true history hound and mechanical purist in your network, and make absolutely sure that the digital overlords know that we will never allow our grit, our iron, and our unvarnished history to fade into the abyss of forgotten content. I need you to go down into the comment section right now and prove to the world that you are a permanent part of the global battalion that still respects the iron, the blood, and the absolute truth, by typing the exact words, "We hold the line." Show them that our formation is unbreakable, and that every single time they try to bury our legacy beneath the noise, they will look down and see us standing strong, waiting for the next order.